Hi guys, it's Belle, and today I'm here to talk to you about some of the research that I did regarding parenting children with Down syndrome, its similarities to parenting typical children, and the stigmas that surround it. I would like to begin by giving you a scenario to think about in your head throughout my entire presentation, and we'll come back to it at the end. So, your unborn child has just been diagnosed with Down syndrome. Throughout your entire life, you've heard horrible things about the syndrome, that the children would be better off dead or in an institution, that carrying a pregnancy with a fetus that has Down syndrome is unbearable, and that parenting a child with Down syndrome is excruciating and impossibly hard. What do you do? How would your choice change if your perception of Down syndrome and parenting children with Down syndrome were more truthful and positive, not based off of century-old stigmas? As an individual who is immersed in the Down syndrome community on a daily basis as a mentor, big sister, and coach, I have always wondered where the negative stigma of parenting a child with Down syndrome comes from. Is it fear? Is it ignorance? While gathering information to understand parenting children with Down syndrome versus a typical child, I only realize how parenting a child with Down syndrome is beautiful, rewarding, and in most every way exactly the same as parenting typical children. What is the difference between parenting typical children and parenting children with Down syndrome? To find this answer, I did a few things. First, I went directly to the source. Linda Nargi, a parent of two older typical children, ages 33 and 31, and two younger girls, ages 13 and 9, both of which have Down syndrome, is a close friend and mentor to me and was the perfect person to ask about the journey of parenting children with Down syndrome. I didn't actually want Lexi in the first place, said Linda of her youngest child with Down syndrome, who was magically adopted by Linda when she was just 3 months old. But now I can't imagine a world where she is not my daughter. Linda gave birth to Lila 13 years ago and adopted Lexi 8 years ago after vowing to not have more children, knowing well what she was getting herself into. I spent one day with Linda to see what her day-to-day routine was with her children with Down syndrome, to see how different it was from the day-to-day routine of a parent to typical children. Come to find out, nothing is really that different. During the day, Linda and I explored the aisles at the local King Soopers and fished around for something to make for dinner as her phone rang and she picked up, learning that Lila had been having a very rough health day at school and asked her teacher if she could go home. After getting Lila in the car, Linda turned to me and said, "Just because my child has Down syndrome does not make me some kind of hero. She gets sick very easily. She has a severe immunodeficiency, and it is terrifying sending her out into the world, but that isn't because she has Down syndrome. There are typical children all around the world who have the exact same immunodeficiency disorder as Lila, and their parents do the exact same things I do for my child. Just because she has Down syndrome does not make me a hero. I'm taking care of my child the best I know how, and that's all I can do." Down syndrome is viewed as such a negative trait in so many different ways, and yet those who are most affected by it view it as a gift and a privilege to get to experience all the syndrome has to offer. After gaining knowledge of the world of parenting a child with Down syndrome, I wanted to know what parents of typical children believe to be true about Down syndrome itself and parenting a child with Down syndrome. I surveyed a random group of 21 parents of typical children and asked them various questions about Down syndrome and their experience in the process of parenting. When faced with the question of what would you do if you got a diagnosis of Down syndrome when trying to have children, 57% of the responses automatically answered in favor of keeping the child and raising it as their own. The other 43% of responses involved answers that included feelings of being scared, undereducated, and not willing enough to live that kind of lifestyle. Although 57% of the responders were willing to parent a child with Down syndrome, 58 of those believe that parenting a child with Down syndrome is exceptionally hard and completely alters the way of life of every family member involved. Even though so many of the surveyed parents either wouldn't carry a pregnancy or raise a child with a Down syndrome diagnosis, all 21 of them believe that people with Down syndrome are genuinely happy, gentle souls, special individuals, and most importantly, individuals like everyone else. So if those with Down syndrome hold all of those qualities, what is seemingly so hard about raising them? Heather Avis, mother of 3 and author of The Lucky Few, Finding God's Bests in the Most Unlikely Places, shared her story about motherhood through adoption and her changing perspective on parenting children with Down syndrome with the world in such a beautiful way. Although Avis wasn't fertile, she still wanted to adopt, until the mention of a baby with Down syndrome stopped her dead in her tracks. But as my heart beat in my chest, I could not shake the words I had just read. A few babies with Down syndrome. Babies with Down syndrome. Down syndrome. Avis shows her frustration with the God she trusts so much. Here we learn how the words Down syndrome are automatically something that changes people's perspective of a situation, but it also gives us a starting point in Avis's development as she is in the process of potentially having to adopt a baby with Down syndrome. 2 adoptions later, Heather Avis is the happy mother of 3 children, 2 of which have Down syndrome and major heart defects, yet they live full and prosperous lives. Not a whole lot of us choose to leave that path of easy, normal, and nice, the one covered in rose petals and lined with solar-powered lamps. But for those of us who do, we really and truly are the lucky few. The final quote of the book reveals how Avis's views on motherhood has changed and how her view of God has also changed. She was so used to the idea that the pretty perfect path was always going to be there and always thought that it was going to be that way because God creates all things. The things you have viewed as burdens, like adoptive children or children with Down syndrome, are actually the things that set people free. These burdens aren't actually burdens at all. They are circumstances so brokenness can become whole and love can be provided for all. Research done by Robert M. Hoddip, Tan M. Lee, Deborah J. Fiedler, and Leela A. Ritchie revealed that parents of children with Down syndrome reported less stress and more child-related rewards than parents of children with other disabilities. Indeed, parents of children with Down syndrome feel equally rewarded compared to parents of same-age typical children. This research allows the understanding of parenting children with Down syndrome as something to be appreciated rather than be cautious or scared of. A child with Down syndrome, or any disability for that matter, is viewed as such a scary thing, but after researching the narrative transitions in views and behaviors of fathers parenting children with disabilities, Aaron Bonsall found that disability in fatherhood can be constructed and reconstructed. Fathers' disability narratives are not static, but should change through significant experiences and everyday interactions. Through this, Bonsall shows that the stigma of parenting disability changes even for the parents doing the parenting, but it is always in a positive way. So after learning more about the world's views on parenting and Down syndrome in general, I know a few things to be certain. Parenting is a gift, no matter what. Each child and parent are different. There is no manual on how to do it correctly because every parent is bound to mess up. The only things parents need to do are provide for their child in the best way they possibly can, protect their child in the best way they possibly can, and love their child in the best way they possibly can. Whether or not a child has Down syndrome does not change the necessity of those 3 things, and a child with Down syndrome does not make any of those things a more difficult task than a child who is typical. So, your unborn child is diagnosed with Down syndrome. What do? Allow the stigma of Down syndrome to mute the beauty in individuals who have different chromosomal makeup? Or do you learn about the new, unknown, yet absolutely beautiful world you are stepping into? The difference in how parents live based on their chromosomal differences is not significant enough to make a negative decision. Parenting children with Down syndrome will not make you a hero or some magical human who can solve all problems, but it will make you a good parent. Being a parent to a child with Down syndrome is beautiful, rewarding, and in most every way, exactly the same as parenting typical children.